Well, hello, everybody. I'm the Director for Common Knowledge Trust. We're a New Zealand registered not-for-profit charitable educational trust. And one of our tiny little branches is that we hold all of the birth and birth coaching skills that hundreds of mums and dads developed in the early 1970s in the United States. And it was quite unique because the United States was just making a shift from follow your doctor's orders and very medicalized childbirth for everybody. And the natural birth movement was just beginning to rise up. And so I gave birth first in that follow your doctor's orders. But at the same time, curiously, in the United States, the first childbirth preparation classes were being taught, and those were Lamaze and Bradley, and they were taught all over the United States, which meant from the 60s until the mid-70s, multiple millions of mothers and fathers went into the hospital with all the assessments, monitoring procedures, and we used some level of skills, which meant that women coped better. Not as many women suffered because we learned to cope and manage, deal with, handle, work through, stay on top of, and to some degree feel in control of our birth because we could just cope better. And our husbands or others helped us do that because they became the childbirth coach. We wanted them to do that. We wanted somebody else to help us cope. And that seemed like that was a good goal. But in reality, that wasn't really the goal of Lamaze and Bradley. And in New Zealand, where our trust is, Grantley Dick Reed was very influential. And those goals were for low-risk women to achieve a natural birth, pain-free labor without any medical care. And as I say in the description below, there were two huge mistakes. And that was the first huge mistake, because these three men who were brilliant and were trying to do something with this over-medicalization of all births, they were trying to say, hey, wait a minute. And their problem was that they decided that they would split women up into low risk and high risk rather than just go 100% of pregnant women will give birth. And that's the reality. 100% of pregnant women will give birth. And it's an activity 100% of pregnant women will do to move from being pregnant to having their baby. And that involves the good, the bad, the ugly, the normal, the abnormal, or the risks or no risks. So we need to really understand the first mistake was that skills weren't advocated for everybody. But then, hey, nobody had had skills previous to that, and humans have lived around the world. And people just don't really focus on having skills around childbirth because there's a truth that pervades all of us, which is there's no way to know what your birth's going to be like, which sadly is then followed by there's really nothing you can do about it or nothing you can do to prepare for it. But every culture is trying to prepare women to have a safe birth, for babies to birth safely, but they aren't focused on doing the task, the activity. And so what I'm doing in this video is to talk about what happened when the natural birth movement really got started, which was actually between my two births. And so I birthed in one trend in 1970, and I birthed in another trend in 1982, which was instead of skills, skills were dismissed as not being able to produce this natural pain-free birth without medical interventions. And so therefore women should just choose that women somehow knew a kind of birth that they wanted, and they should write it in a birth plan, and birth professionals should be giving them that kind of birth or involving them in informed consent and decision making. So the natural birth movement really, really exploded. And at that time, as birthing better was developing in the early 1970s, the mothers and fathers that I worked with who developed the skills fell right outside of that low-risk normal birth. Sure, some women were low risk, but the majority of them had some sort of a risk, and some were very, very high risk. So basically, we were thrown away back then, and that wasn't acceptable to families. Families wanted to have something to do for themselves. They wanted to be able to work together in their baby's birth, and many women were perfectly comfortable with modern medical care because that differentiated them from women who were living where there was no medical care. They felt privileged to have medical care. And in fact, what was curious was that when I gave birth in 1970, there was a 4.5% cesarean rate. We all labored because cesareans were so serious as a surgery, and they were done really to save mothers' lives. Very, very major abdominal surgery. So these skills developed when a whole bunch of things were occurring at the same time. Women wanted their husbands in when they had cesareans. Because the natural birth movement was coming, women were talking about having a vaginal birth after a cesarean, but there was a high risk of a uterine rupture with a classical cesarean that cut your uterus like this. So, and styles changed, right? And people forget, but I lived through this, so I don't forget. We started to wear bikinis. I know this sounds absolutely bizarre. How did wearing bikinis change the maternity model? It was simple. We didn't want to be left with a scar, right? So the doctors came up with a bikini cut. They didn't make up that word, right? We were wearing bikinis, the low-line incision, and that solved a bunch of problems. It became safer to have a VBAC because it was less likely that the uterus would rupture, although there is a lot of thinning out around the scar tissue that still exists. It's often not as life-threatening and can be repaired. We didn't need to be knocked out during surgery, so fathers could come in. They developed spinals and now epidurals and now family-centered cesareans. And the other thing that happened when I gave birth and 95% of us were laboring, we labored whether we had risks or not. We labored whether we suffered or not. We labored for hours or days. We labored whether we coped or whether we were traumatized by it. We labored whether there was a good outcome. We labored if there was a tragic outcome. Because there wasn't really the modern maternity system to either diagnose or to deal with the risks. And then what did modern women want? We want to reduce the risks. So for us who had breech babies, we didn't want our breech babies to have a problem. For us who had twins or triplets, we didn't want our twins or triplets to have a problem. If we had Rh negative, we didn't want our babies to have a problem. If we had a placenta down near our cervix, we didn't want that to be a problem. We didn't want problems. We're modern women. We demand that risks are reduced. So therefore, the modern medical system responded to that. And that's why, really, we have more cesareans today. In the same way, what do you think epidurals are about, right? It's not reducing a risk, it's reducing the suffering. And what's the problem with the suffering? It was the problem that the natural birth movement in the 1980s decided skills weren't of value. They didn't see the value of women reducing their own suffering by coping, managing, working better, working together with their partner. They just wanted the outcome, this natural birth. And this is where the good and the bad of the natural birth movement has been absolutely crazy in my lifetime. And I have an obligation at my age now to speak about this because we have been going down a path that's been based on an idea, and that gets explained in the description. I'll talk about it more. That idea has words. The words ask for actions. The actions, the ideas, the words, and the actions all want to have a goal. Right? So the natural birth movement, the idea was that pregnancy and childbirth are normal, natural, physiological life events that rarely require medical care. Those are words, right? That's a statement. And actions are supposed to be formed around it. Nobody goes back and says, is that statement valid? And the statement isn't valid. It doesn't even come close to being valid. And as I explain in the description, just take 1,000 women who are childbearing years, put them in a room together. How many of those women already have health issues, right? 1 out of 1,000? No, more likely 980 out of 1,000. Or they have poverty, or they have abuse, or they have substance abuse, or da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Psychological issues, emotional issues, economic issues, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. So 1,000 women who have childbearing years, many of us have issues. And so the natural birth movement already has a problem in its formative idea and the words, right? Even to the words natural and normal. Is it natural for a baby to die or a mother to die? Is it normal? Is it physiological? Yes, it is. We don't want that. Is it natural for women to tear down there? Normal, physiological? Yes, it is. We would like not to have that either, right? Is it normal for women to feel overwhelmed by the naturally occurring pain of labor contractions? That's called suffering. That's what we all heard about. Women suffered in childbirth. It wasn't that there was a risk that became a death. It was we didn't cope. It fucking hurts, right? So we have to get really real about it. So the natural birth movement put forward a statement as though we all agreed with what it meant. As though normal and natural means easy, good outcome, nothing burger, no worries, just let it happen. And then people respond to it by saying, but women died in childbirth. It isn't either or. It is lots in between. So if you take those 1,000 childbearing women who aren't pregnant, who have issues, and then they all get pregnant together, then you know some of those issues stop being issues, some of them get worse, and new issues come along for either the mother or the baby. And they're all natural, and they're all normal. We may not like them, but they exist, and they're natural and normal. And so already this natural birth foundational statement isn't actually accurate, and it's deceptive, and it has led to the bad things about the natural birth movement. And there are good things. I'll talk about all of that again because I'm going to do a bunch of videos about these topics, right? So then, if you take those same 1,000 women and they're all birthing, then we know that some of the issues that have occurred before pregnancy may not have occurred in pregnancy, or other new ones occurred for the mother or the baby. And birth just does the same thing. Things happen. Stuff happens, right? And so we need to understand that when we use an idea that pregnancy and childbirth are normal life events that rarely require medical care, we are giving to each other as women deceptive misinformation. And we don't know how to respond to that. So if that statement was actually true, if out of 1,000 childbearing women, 1,000 pregnant women, 1,000 birthing women, 980 women easily birthed without any problems to the mother or baby, then of course we would see and be right to say to doctors, why are you doing all the assessments, monitoring procedures? But as women, modern women, in my lifetime between the 70s and the 80s, we became risk averse. We weren't willing to really deliver our breech babies. Even today, if you go into the Facebook pages of breech births, everybody's trying to turn their baby. They're spending hours and hours and hours and hours to spin their baby or do homeopathics or the Webster technique, right? I mean, my goodness, we were trying to have this perfect birth in which we can say no to medical care because of the risks. And this is what's nuts. Okay, so what happens is that we have to understand that the childbirth conversation today is based on an idea, pregnancy and childbirth are normal life events, and it's based on those words. And we have other words. Birth is instinctive. Women should be left alone. Women should write a birth plan. Women know what they want at their birth. They just need to tell people, and the birth professionals should give them the birth that they want. And if it changes, women should be involved in the decision making. We have words and language and actions that support this idea that pregnancy and childbirth are normal life events that rarely require medical care. That's the idea. And what is the goal? The goal is to have a natural birth. This is what Lamaze and Bradley and Grantley Dick Reed wanted and got carried over by all the famous authors of the 70s and the 80s, to have a natural birth, a pain-free labor with no medical interventions. And this is where it becomes very complex, because when I gave birth in 1970, we had assessments, monitoring procedures. Those were called standards of care. Those were the things that we wanted. We didn't always like them. We thought many of them were fiddly. We found them a lot irritating. But we wanted them as compared to women who live where there is no medical care and who cannot avoid the risks. So Modern medicine believes that birth is safe after the fact. The natural birth movement believes that birth is safe until proven unsafe. But if you don't do assessments, if you don't do monitoring, then how do you know? And in fact, you don't know, right? And that becomes the problem because the medical profession wants to do all of this fiddling. We as modern women want them to fiddle more because when I gave birth in 1970, there were no ultrasounds. There was not a lot of the blood testing. There was no constant fetal monitoring. There was none of this stuff. Now women can spout to you how many ultrasounds they have and all those little details and everything. Everybody is so risk averse, and the medical profession is responding to that by giving us more care. And if we want less care around childbirth and pregnancy, then we have to understand, what does that all mean? So when fathers and mothers were developing birthing better in the early 1970s, we were dealing with all of this, just as you're dealing with all of this. We knew back then, because Lamaze and Bradley in the United States and Grantley Dick Reed in New Zealand were advocating for low-risk women to use their skills to achieve a natural birth, pain-free labor without medical intervention. And after a generation of us trying, not enough women succeeded. So the next group of natural birth advocates, women and home birth midwives and childbirth educators, decided that skills didn't matter, and that was the second huge mistake. Skills hugely mattered because we coped better, and that's a good goal, right? An outcome, or not having medical care at a birth, is now considered to be the premium goal. Natural birth without medical care and a pain-free labor. And then we add on to it a place and in water with a midwife or home alone or whatever. We add on to it. But the goal was to avoid medical care. So in one of the other videos in our eCam live playlist on our YouTube, Birthing Better 1 in YouTube, I talked about interventions. I've spent years, since the 70s, trying to explain in the natural birth movement, we need to have a self-learning skilled birthing population for all births, right? So this is the solution of the problem we have now. Because with the actions and the problems we have now, the idea that childbirth, pregnancy and childbirth are normal life events that rarely require medical care, the words attached to it, the actions, make a birth plan, you know what your birth is, you want, trust birth, let it be instinctive, say no to medical care, blah, 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 blah. We know that not enough women are achieving the goals of having a natural birth without medical interventions, which has led, in my lifetime, between the 70s and the 80s, this phenomenal leap of shame, blame, guilt, disappointment, anger, frustration, and trauma about childbirth. We as women are doing this to each other. Honestly, I have listened to tens and thousands of birth stories around the world in the past 50 years. And I hear women say this to their friends. I had a home birth. You had a hospital birth. I read nothing and I trusted. You read everything and had all these interventions. And they say this about their children. She was my cesarean. He was my home birth. We have to stop this. Really, honestly, we women have to stop this. We have to stop this. And in every video, I'm saying the same thing. We have to stop this. So what's the solution? It's simple. What's the idea? What's the new idea? It's a simple idea. 100% of pregnant women will give birth. We know that. Can't get out of pregnancy without giving birth one way or another. Yes, an abortion is a birth. We know what we are doing, and we are choosing to do that for personal reasons, whether you like it or not. Women throughout time have tried to avoid unwanted pregnancies. Throughout time, we have tried to terminate pregnancies because we know the commitment it takes to children. We know the stress on resources, the emotional stress. We know this. If we are not in societies that support us as families, we as women will try not to get pregnant and we will try to terminate pregnancies. Or a birth is a miscarriage. Those things happen There was actually a 1700 text really talked about how did women feel about miscarriages back then. They were delighted because without birth control, without safe terminations, many women had multiple children. That takes out of our lives. We may want to be parents, but we may also want to be creative, or we may want to work. We may want to do all of these things. So when we choose to get pregnant, which most of us don't anyway, and when we choose to carry a baby to term and to raise that baby, 100% of us are going to give birth. That's this new idea. It's just a reality. We are going to give birth if we're pregnant. And it's an activity each one of us does with our baby, whether we are alone, whether we are in war, whether we are safe, whether we are loved, whether we are poor, whether we live around the world with or without medical care, whether there's a drought, whether there's a tsunami, whether we're being abused, whether we have substance abuse, whether we have health issues or not health issues. 100% of pregnant women are going to give birth one way or the other, and it's an activity each of us does. We have 100 people in the room. We cannot stop for lunch. We cannot give it to them. And a birth is a surgical birth. Our bodies are emotionally, hormonally preparing to labor and have a vaginal birth, but the activity starts when we get in the car, drive to the hospital, get prepped, have the surgery, and we can use skills throughout all of that. So this new idea is simple. 100% of pregnant women will give birth one way or another. Giving birth is always an activity each woman does with her baby. Those are an idea. Those are words. It's normal and natural to self-learn birth and birth coaching skills in pregnancy. That's an action. And then use those skills to work through the activity of birthing your baby. That's an action. No matter where you birth, no matter who is present, no matter your circumstances or your beliefs, no matter your choices or your lack of choices or your change of choices, no matter the circumstances of what happens at your birth, it's an activity you have to do. When we lack skills, when skills were removed from us in the mid-70s, less women were skilled, which meant labor and delivery nurses and obstetricians or midwives saw fewer skilled women instead of the multiple millions of women and men who were skilled in the 60s and the 70s, at least in the United States. Right? We used skills and we felt empowered by our births. We didn't always like it. We didn't always like the stuff that was going on or how people treated us. We used skills. Why? What was the goal? We coped. We managed. We dealt with. We worked through. We handled. We stayed on top of, and we felt some degree of being in control. That needs to be the goal. We need to grow a skilled birthing population, a self-learning skilled birthing population. It's not the responsibility of the obstetrician, not the responsibility of the midwife, not the responsibility of the doula, and childbirth educators. Yes, you can teach skills. Lamaze was taught, but there's now the internet, so we're an online course. There's now a library. That's been around for a long time. Share books, but make it skills, not information. If you're 3 centimeters dilated, what are you going to do? How are you going to behave? What are the skills you're going to use? If you're 8 centimeters, or if you're on the way to the hospital, what are you going to do to work through the activity of birthing your baby? What are you going to do? What are you going to use? How are you going to behave? What are people going to see? How are they going to see you behave? How are they going to see you using skills or not skills? Right? So we need to have a different goal. So who is going to lead this change in childbirth? I have heard since the 1970s that women need to lead the change. Yeah, well, I want to tell you the truth about this. When the natural birth movement started in the 1970s, it was a tiny group. New Zealand now has a midwifery-led model of care. It's brilliant, and I'll talk more about that. Got put in place in 1990. Everything everybody wants there is there, and I'll talk about it in another video. It was led by a tiny group of home birth midwives and natural birth advocates who wanted home births. And they just pushed. They're very loud, they're very vocal, they're very organized. But that leaves out the majority of the rest of us, right? And it becomes complicated Because when I teach midwives and I say to them, what do you want? They say more natural births. Well, that's a good goal. How are you going to get more natural births? Well, we want less interventions. So if you make a list of interventions, there are 30 of them. And an ideal birth has 23 things. So women have to avoid 30 and have 23 in order to have this considered to be ideal birth. And that is just too hard. Women are doing this to each other. It's just too hard. We can't do this. We have to stop. We have to have a different goal, different conversation, different idea, different words, because we need to see that the goals match the hopes. So the hopes are for more natural birth. How we're doing? How are we doing? In New Zealand, where there's a midwifery-led maternity care for a generation, the cesarean rate has gone up from 12.9% to 27 or so. How are we doing? How many women are giving birth without any of these 30 interventions and therefore can't claim to have a natural birth? We're failing because the ideas are wrong, the words are wrong, the actions are wrong, and the goals are wrong. And we have to change that. And we as women will never organize because we get pregnant, then we're not pregnant, right? Birth professionals see us, the next us, and maybe us again. So they have to give the message, and the message is very simple. Hi, how are you? I'm a birth professional. I want to respect your choices. Here's a handout of the skills-based methods that I know about. Self-learn one or more of them. We want you to do this activity of birthing your baby with some skills. That's a good plan. 24 weeks. Just ask what you've learned. Breathing, great relaxation at 28 weeks. Great meditation or body work or internal work or nothing. It's okay, just mark it in your notes. 24 weeks breathing. You don't have to know what they're doing. They're grown-ups. You just need to know that they have learned skills or they haven't learned skills. That's the way it is. Some won't. But the more you push, the more women will. And the more women will say to their friends and relatives, my ex and I, or my so-and-so and I, or whoever, or I alone, I used some skills. Didn't do it perfectly, but boy, I felt a lot more comfortable. I coped better. Great goal. And then at birth, if you see that woman coping well, gee whiz, praise her. Because in the 60s and the 70s, multiple millions of women and men used skills, and labor and delivery nurses and obstetricians saw that. And they love working with skilled families. They believed that those skills, because that was being told to them, we're going to produce these normal births, pain-free labors without medical care. They put their nose up to that. They should have. But nobody was thinking of the bigger issue, which was women suffered. We had stopped suffering. We stopped the suffering by identifying childbirth as an infrequent, one-off, can't be replayed, life-transforming, dynamic activity each woman does with her baby, and we should elevate it to an activity that we want to be skilled to, and that everybody is saying you should have some level of skills. My goodness, we're crazy that we've been doing this. This has just been crazy for me because I saw the break. I saw the message not being delivered. When the doctors, when Lamaze and Bradley were saying, this is for low-risk women, well, what do you do about high-risk women, right? It was only for women who could achieve this natural birth with pain-free labor. What do you do if you have pain? What do you do if you have medical care? So we needed to have something different, and that's what we at Birthing Better and Common Knowledge Trust have done, right? So then at the birth, if people are, if the woman and whoever is doing well, praise them. It's easier for you to be with them. And if they look a little bit overwhelmed, go back to their notes and say, oh, you learned breathing at 24 weeks. Well, I said I did, but I didn't. Well, okay, well, you stuck with that. No, I did. Well, use it now. But I want a natural birth. Now I'm wired for sound. It's your baby's birth. You got pregnant to have your baby. Work through the activity. Sorry, these things are happening, but work through the activity. Oh, okay. Or I'm lying on the table now having a cesarean. I didn't plan. It's your baby's birth. Work through the activity of birthing your baby. Do it, right? That's what we need. So that's the new conversation in childbirth. Can we do this? Absolutely, we can do it. because our trust has been doing it since the 90s, and I did it for 25 years before that. And tens and thousands of families have used skills, and hundreds of thousands of families do use skills, except most of those skills-based methods are still targeting low-risk women to have a natural birth, pain-free labor with no medical care. We have to drop all of that. We just have saves and activity. You got to do it. Just get on with it. Just get on with it. Do you think the women in Syria in war don't birth because they feel unsafe? Don't be silly. Do you honestly believe that your oxytocin hormones are going to reduce your sense of pain in labor? Don't be nuts. This is information that women are giving to each other that is deceptive and misleading. Women do not have to feel safe in order to birth. Fearing childbirth does not stop you from giving birth. What stops you from giving birth is if your baby doesn't fit well through your pelvis, it can be longer. If your baby doesn't have any trouble coming through your body, you'll be standing on your head screaming fucking bloody murder and being terrified all the way down to your soul. It doesn't matter. And when you have skills, you will use them because you have two choices. Use them or don't. And in that choice is coping or managing to some degree or not. What's your choice? Get on with it. So, we need more birth providers to step up. And we have an open-ended invitation to all birth providers, whether they're obstetricians or midwives or doulas or childbirth educators, to help them put in place this protocol. Because what we learned was that women and men who cope better in birth tell their friends. They begin to get skilled. Okay, so I'm running out of battery on my computer. I need to go. So please follow us on Facebook. Please follow us on YouTube. Please subscribe on our YouTube channel. Please spread these videos. You are important. I can't do this alone, and honestly, I'm not going to live for another 76 years. So get on with it. Make this fundamental societal change in how we think about birth, how the words we use, the actions we take, and the goals that we're trying to achieve. All right, see you later. Bye-bye.